turn you down a little bit. So again, this is Daniel Piedra. He's somebody I took interest in because, for one, he served his mission in Sacramento, California, which is about 120 miles, 30 miles north of where I live. And he also said that I was wrong on some of my comments about the Book of Mormon, but more than that, I was very interested in the fact that he'd read the Book of Mormon more than 50 times, or are you on number 50?
Oh, I don't know, somewhere around there.
That's
I've lost
crazy.
track. I was keeping track up until a while ago, and then I stopped counting. So I don't know.
Well, very good, very good. So, Daniel, let's get a little bit of background. My name's AJ Hill or Arthur Hill, as you can see on
Hmm.
the screen there. Um, got a brother, and we weren't raised in the church, and but we joined when we were about 9 or 10 years old, and uh, I left the church when I was 17 and came back when I was about 31, 32 years old, and discovered a whole new world about the gospel and about the church that I'd never discovered before. And so it was quite, uh, now it's 25 years later and I'm on fire still. And were you born into the covenant or?
Yeah, I was. Actually, my story goes back through South America. So my parents were probably among the first 300 or so members of the church to be baptized in Uruguay, which was the first mission in South America back in the early 50s. So the church established their first mission in South America in Uruguay and proceeded to, sort of expand from there. But my parents joined the church separately without knowing each other in two different parts of the country. My father lived in the interior in a more rural area of Uruguay. My mother lived in the heart of Uruguay, in Montevideo, the capital city. And they both came across missionaries who taught them the discussions and who basically brought them into the church. And this would have been the first wave of missionaries in those early years of the first mission in the church in South America. So, in fact, one of them, one of the missionaries that my father met at the time, well, I don't believe he was the one that baptized them, but he was among the missionaries that he had connected with. My father was really into music, performing music, in particular piano and organ. So he was obviously anybody who plays the organ specifically, as you know, in our churches of is in high demand often, right?
Yes, yes.
So my father at the time was got really involved as a youth. So he was between 17 and 18 years of age when he came to know the church, and he was really really caught up in a lot of youth activities, which at the time involved a lot of theater and music. And so it was something that he really, grabbed onto, and he was really involved with that. So the missionaries were also very much involved with the youth program and the young adults and all that kind of stuff. So of course, not being not being very much different in terms of their age, right? It would have made sense. And the only thing is that obviously many of them were coming from the United States. Most of them were American elders, right?
Is
Um, yep.
I had a question. Um, is there a kind of an attachment to from? I mean, we have more members outside the United States now than we do
Right.
have on the inside. Is there, especially in those early days, do you think there was kind of this is a unique individual, and I'm more apt to listen to him, like the Savior said,
Uh-huh.
I will never be accepted inside my own city, but outside of my city, I will be accepted. And is there
Right.
something to be said of that of missionaries going abroad, especially in the early days of South America and Africa and places like that?
I think in certain countries that's possible. I wouldn't say that for the early years in South America even today, probably. Definitely some of the things that I picked that my father shared with me and that some of his colleagues or friends from that period who have provided testimonies. There's a website, or sorry, yeah, there is a website and a YouTube channel actually that was put together by pioneers of the Uruguay mission, and so many of them are, still alive and from that time period and shared their testimonies and experiences. And one thing that I picked up on, and this is from my father as well as some of his friends at the time who joined the church, was that it was a very small group. I mean, there were rarely wards, they were branches and very small branches, and often they were relying upon the missionaries to not only be missionaries, but also be in the branch presidency. So they were really dependent upon, sort of the missionaries as well as mission presidents and others who played a very important part in that, role of leadership, which makes sense because obviously you're bringing up a new, membership, and you're not going to have a lot of senior members of the church yet at that point in time, right? But one thing that came through loud and clear was that there was a lot of opposition. There was a lot of I don't know, hatred is a strong word, but there was a lot of hatred towards the LDS church at the time, mainly because they represented America, right? An American sort of religion with everything that comes with it. And if you live in South America, you either support America or you're on the other side, which there's a lot of anger and a lot of opposition towards anything that that comes from America, unfortunately.
That's quite area. Let me
Yeah.
ask a question pertaining to that. See, in my thinking, my what would you say, ignorance, I
Mhm.
would thought that Uruguay was a very third world, very uneducated, very only religion that was maybe a part of that area would be Catholicism because there was heavy handedness
Yeah,
in a lot of
that part
ways.
is true. Yeah.
So, can you kind of describe what your dad would have described when he was growing up, as far
Yeah,
as some of the there's the actual truth, and then there's the
sure.
what I would say the myths that I would think about.
Yeah. So, yeah, a lot of Latin America is still very misunderstood by North Americans. I will
And I
say
spent a
that,
year and a half in Panama, by the way.
yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, no,
So
sure. And the thing is about Latin America is that, sometimes you tend to draw that division, you know, in the southern states, Arizona and Texas, and everything south of that becomes Latin America. When in reality, that's like saying Europeans are all the same. Latin America is very different, right? So you have your Central Americans, which are also very different amongst themselves, and then you have Latin Americans in South America, who again are very different cultures, very different, and even the languages are different, right? And what I mean by that is, it's not unlike what happens in English when you compare Australians, Scottish, English, Welsh, Americans, and Canadians. They all speak English, but they have very different, slightly different dialects, right? And that's exactly what happens in South America. But the cultures are very different too. So the fact that the church, decided to start in Uruguay probably had more to do with the fact that at the time, basically from around the 30s, 1930s to the 70s, Uruguay was by far the most developed and stable country in Latin America. Uh, Very high literacy rates. Still to this day, they are number one in South America. Very well educated, a very large middle class, very small lower class, and lots of equity and equality way ahead of its time. I mean, Uruguay was the first country to give women the vote, the blacks vote. While the U.S. was going through the civil rights in the 60s, Uruguay had figured that out way back, before that. So it was well established that it was a country that saw equality and equal rights for everybody. So I think that had a lot to do with it. And it was very much, they used to call it the Switzerland of South America. And so it was very well developed. So the church went there, and my father had an opportunity once he was baptized, and he was baptized when he was 18, which again I think took a lot of courage, for me to have joined
18,
the
huh?
church. Yeah,
You
for
said
me to have
18 years old. Yeah.
18, yeah. So for me to have joined the church at that age, given how much opposition there was, I mean, you can only put yourself in those shoes and wonder whether you would have done the same thing or whether you would have just walked away and said, nah, this isn't for me. But yeah, he faced a lot of opposition. He remembers walking down some of the streets sometimes with the missionaries. This is after they were baptized and doing some work, right? Like missionary work with the missionaries and having folks drive by and throw things at them and, call them all sorts of things. So, they put up with a lot in those first early years, but they were pretty strong and they had, obviously the freedom in the country that supported the growth of the church. And he met a lot of interesting people back in the day. My father got involved with not just music, but he got involved in translation because my father had studied English quite a bit and he knew quite a lot of English. So when the general authorities came for area conferences, for example, he was often involved in translation services for them. And so he got to meet uh, George George C. Scott, who was later an apostle. He became actually quite good friends with him. In fact, here's another funny story. Many, many, many decades later, I think it was like early 2000s, my father was called to be a sealer at the temple here in Toronto. And he was required to travel to the nearest point where he could hook up with an apostle because when you're called as a sealer, you have to be sealed or, sorry,
Or
be
sustain
ordained
or
to set aside, set apart,
set
sorry,
apart,
set
set
apart,
apart. There you go.
and given those keys of sealing from an apostle.
I didn't
Okay.
know that.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting.
Right. So you can't get it from from a 70. It has to come from an apostle. So
Wow.
he traveled. It just happened that George C. Scott was in town nearby in Buffalo. Buffalo's about an hour drive from us here in Toronto. So my father and mother crossed the border, drove an hour south to Buffalo, met up with him there in a stake center somewhere, and that's where where he was set apart as a sealer. So many many years later, that circle sort of came back around, right? Because he had met him in Uruguay, and here they were now many decades later, having him seal him or set him aside as
Set
set him
apart.
apart as a sealer. Yeah,
What is wrong with our tongue sometimes?
I know.
Society these
Yeah,
days we cannot find the right
yeah,
terminology.
I know. But anyway, so that's kind of how it went, right? I mean, the country was probably in good standing to receive the church and to have the mission begin in those days, and then of course from there it just continued to grow. And the funny thing, of course, is that the church then began to expand into other missions, and the church began to grow in many places like Mexico and Brazil
So
and
Uruguay was even
Peru.
before Mexico, you're saying?
Oh yeah, Uruguay was the first actual mission opened south of the
Wow,
U.S. Yeah,
that's
before
pretty.
Mexico.
Yeah,
Yeah, but it's a small country, right? Like the
right.
country is only 3.5 million. So you're only going to have so much growth there. Obviously, eventually, when they opened up missions in Mexico and Brazil and Peru, those countries grew very quickly because the population is much larger.
Can
But
you?
that took years, right? And I mean, think about this. For decades, there were no temples in Latin America. My parents were married in 64. So they came together after being baptized at different places, and they came together and they were married, and they were married at the stake center. And then they traveled a year later. They saved money. So this was in 63. And in 1964, they traveled to Salt Lake City, and they stayed with some friends who they had come to know in Uruguay again through different missionary connections and all this kind of stuff. And they traveled to Salt Lake City, and they were sealed in the Salt Lake Temple because that was the only temple you could go to. Well, you could have gone to any other temple, I guess, but that was,
There was
you
very
know,
few of them at the time, so it's
sure. And there was none in Latin America, none at
right.
all. So the
Yeah.
first temple in Latin America was in the 80s in Brazil, right? And then in
Right, right.
Mexico too, but Brazil would have been the closest one to anyone in Uruguay. So obviously it took many, many, many more decades for Uruguay to have its own temple and for other countries like Argentina to have their own temple too. So that was the sacrifice that a lot of members of the church had to make back then, is that if they wanted to be sealed, they had to travel a significant distance. And here's another really cool story. So when my parents traveled to be sealed in the Salt Lake Temple. They made their appointment, and then when they went to the temple, I'm not sure exactly how this happened, but it turned out that there was Elder Spencer W. Kimball, who was an apostle at the time, who again had met my father in Uruguay. Had my father had translated for him at some state conferences and that kind of thing. Ended up sealing them. So when you look at my parents' sealing record, they were sealed by Elder Spencer W. Kimball before he became President Kimball, right? And it actually goes one step before that. I should have given you this one too. Is that when my father was confirmed to the Melchizedek priesthood, his best friend, who had been baptized about a month ahead of him, was the one who confirmed him or ordained him. Sorry, ordained him to the Melchizedek priesthood. And his friend had been ordained by Spencer W. Kimball in Uruguay. So when I look at my or not my patriarchal blessing, but when I look at my priesthood line of authority, right, my father ordained me, who was ordained by his best friend, who was ordained by Spencer W. Kimball, and then it goes from there all the
Wow.
way back to
Probably feel pretty
yeah,
special. Can you tell me
yeah.
about your mom's experiences?
Yeah. My mother was about 16 when she joined the church. Again, by herself. She had a father and a mother, not unlike my parents. Sorry, my father. My father also was very, very much Catholic, but not really practicing Catholic on his side. My
Right.
mother, a little bit different. My mother's mother was more of a practicing Catholic. Uh,
Sure.
her her father wasn't. He was, Catholic, but he didn't necessarily go to church too much. So there was a bit of opposition there when my mother started taking the discussions, but she went ahead and my mother's mother, my grandmother, was more open to letting her, explore. And basically, she went through, took the lessons, took the discussions, and decided to be baptized. And then a few months after that, her mother was also baptized, which was uh, a really big step for that family, given the fact that she was very much, a very strong Catholic. But her father never joined the church. We did the temple work for him after he passed away in the late 70s. But yeah, that was sort of her entry into the church. And as I mentioned, they didn't know each other at the time, my father and mother, when they were baptized. They later came to know each other when my father moved to Montevideo, to the capital, and that's where they came to know each other. They met at I think it was a young adult activity,
Of
and then
course.
they, yeah, of course,
The saints hanging together, and
that's right, yeah,
there's not very many, so
yeah.
it's
By this point, this would have been the 60s. So by this point, there were wards. There were several wards in
oh
in Montevideo. And so that's pretty much where I come into the picture because I always joke around that I actually went with my parents to be sealed. I was inside my mother. My mother was like 6 months pregnant.
all right, all
And
right.
that I think they were sealed in September, October, and I was born in November when they got
Wow,
back to Uruguay. So
that's
yeah,
that's wonderful. Now, okay, you are about 48, 50 years old, or
no, I'm a little older than that. I'm
how old are you?
50, 58.
58. Oh, you're
Yeah.
older than I am. Okay.
Mhm.
So that makes sense. You look very young to say the least.
Okay, thanks.
uh, um, the question is now, there's a lot of our generation that's leaving the church over, whatever the CES letter and things like
Mhm.
that are coming up. I don't want to step into it too far, but is because I want to kind of go back and ask you your journey,
Mhm.
and I'm trying to preface it like uh, I want you to think about the opposition that you faced, and because of all the internet influences and things like that are out there. Can you
Mhm.
tell me how you found your testimony and you kind of just kept it going, and you're like, you feel like you're on fire with the gospel, it seems like to me.
Yeah, I mean, I like I so I grew up in the church, right? So I was born in obviously under the covenant, and in '72, my parents decided that because the political situation and the stability in Uruguay had changed dramatically, they were no longer the Switzerland of South America. But unfortunately, bad decisions by certain governments and what have you led to poor economic situations and a lot of economic and political upheaval. They started wondering if this was really a place they wanted to stay in, and they decided that it was best to get out. There was also another side story where my uncle, my father's brother, had gotten involved in some very leftist sort of politics, and was very much involved in trying to upend the current government. So my father and mother felt that it was time to get out of that country and to look for greener pastures. So they tried to immigrate to the United States, to Australia, and to Canada. Canada came through first and with visas, and so they didn't sit around and wait. We just decided to leave. We had friends here as well from Uruguay who had also joined the church back in the '60s, and my parents knew them, and so we had some friends here. So we came here, and this is where I grew up. I came to Canada when I was 8 years of age, so I've been able to retain both languages. I learned English. I didn't know a word of English when I came here, but as a child, you learn anything. So, yeah, I
Are you sure
basically,
I couldn't learn? I can't learn a second language no matter.
well, at that age, you can learn pretty much anything. So if
Yeah,
you had been taken anywhere at that age, you would have learned whatever language they threw at you. Probably could have learned two or three languages if I had been exposed to them. But
yeah, okay.
anyway, so I grew up in this area here outside of Toronto. And went through primary, went through the youth program, always kind of borrowing your testimony on somebody else, usually your parents or teachers or what have you. And so then time came when I was 19, and of course everybody starts wondering if you're going to go on a mission. And I knew I was going to go on a mission, but I wasn't quite ready to go at 19. And so I didn't go. And I'm sure a lot of people, including probably my bishop at the time, probably figured out, forget it, he's not going to go. And they gave up because a year went by and almost 2 years went by. And then I decided I wanted to go at around 20 when I turned 20, knowing I'd probably be closer to 21 by the time I went. So what I decided to do was I knew I wanted to go, but I wanted to have a testimony of my own. And so I basically just dedicated about 2, 3 months in the summer of 1985 to read the Book of Mormon, cover to cover. Every day I read and read and read. I was traveling to school and work, and I would take the bus or a train into Toronto, and on the way I'd be reading, and so yeah, I got through it like in 2 months, I think. And yeah, that was my first experience reading the Book of Mormon, and it left a very powerful impact on me. I had no doubt that it was, that I had felt the Spirit and that it was the Word of God, and it prepared me to go on my mission. So, by the fall of '85, I was called to serve in the Sacramento, California Spanish mission. So I served as one of 16 missionaries who taught in Spanish. The other 188, I think it was, were all English speaking missionaries. But
Wow.
we were in a small group that taught in to the Spanish members in wherever we were called to serve. So it was enough of a testimony that it got me on my mission strong enough. And then from there, daily activities on my mission, reading the scriptures almost daily, and all the things that happened to you just built my testimony to the point where by the time I got home and 2 years later, I had a very strong testimony by then. And then I went to school, decided to
Where'd you
finish
go to
my,
school?
I decided to finish my studies at BYU. So I went
Okay.
to Provo, and I spent the next 4 or 5 years in Provo studying. And of course, that puts you smack dab in the middle of, Mormon culture and everything, which I loved. I mean, I loved Provo. I know some people don't exactly like it. They think it's kind of corny or whatever, but I loved it. I thought it was amazing. I would live in Provo any time. I loved the just being around BYU, being around the Mormon culture, and just being around the mountains. I really miss that. We don't have mountains out here, and so I miss just the scenery, right? The scenic beauty of those that part of the country.
What was
Um,
your study while you were at BYU?
I was studying, originally I wanted to be a high school teacher. So I studied subjects that I would be able to teach. So my undergraduate work was in geography. And then when I got there, they told me, they said, you need a minor. I said, a minor? Yeah, you have to have a minor if you're going to teach, like if you're going to get a teaching degree. All right, well, I haven't given this any thought. What can I take? And so they gave me this list of minors, and one of them was Spanish. And I said, oh, okay, I'll take Spanish.
Okay.
How's that? Is that okay? And they said, sure, yeah, that's fine. You can take Spanish. So I minored in Spanish, which actually came in handy later because I did actually teach some Spanish classes when I first started, after my studies and stuff. So I did that, and then I also did a master's degree at BYU in urban studies. Again, always with the idea that I would teach high school. But when I came back here to Toronto, to this area, it was really difficult to get a job. I just couldn't find opportunities that were full time and permanent. So one thing led to the next, and I started getting into post secondary education, colleges and universities. And, you know, 15, 18 years later, here I am still working at one of the local universities here. So
And what do you teach at that university?
I don't teach. I taught for a number of years, but now I don't teach. I'm in administration. I'm in management.
Okay.
So I'm
And what
actually in
did you teach when you were teaching?
it's funny because I didn't teach anything that I had actually studied for. Although, yeah, I did teach a couple of part-time Spanish courses, which
Okay.
got me started. And then after that, I taught mostly adult education and education courses because of the my background. Obviously, with a Bachelor of Education, I had studied a lot of, pedagogical principles of, and I had become very interested in adult education. So I had also taken a certificate in adult education when I came home here. So that kind of set me up for the kind of work that I do now, which is I've been working in continuing education for about 15, 18 years. And now almost everything that we do is online education. So I'm an assistant director that oversees online program development, course development, and design.
Oh, wow. Now, during the course of your life, you talked about reading the Book of Mormon and getting a, a, a strong enough testimony at that time to proceed on to your mission with some confidence.
Mhm.
Uh, was there any other life changing experiences that would you say that this was a turning point on even becoming uh, having a stronger testimony in your life?
Yeah, definitely. There were two, probably maybe three. And this is a key, I think. People need to have these experiences in their lives to keep them really well grounded in the church. And even after you have these, it's still possible to lose your testimony, and because life hits you and life throws a lot of things at you, a lot of, curveballs that can really push people away, and sometimes make you feel like, hey, the world's against me, and where's God in all of this? And why is this happening to me? I went on a mission and I did my best, and yet life's not working out for me.
Which
And it,
reminds me, which
yeah.
reminds me that maybe 30, maybe 40% of missionaries that return
Mhm.
actually stay in the church.
Yeah, there's no guarantee. Serving a mission doesn't guarantee that you're going to stay in the church because it gives you a great grounding, but it's not like you can come home and say, okay, well, that's done now. I'm good to go for the rest of my life. You still need to keep doing everything, reading your scriptures, praying, going to church, doing what you can, repenting of whatever sins you may have along the way. So that doesn't stop, right? And I find that where people have difficulties is where they stop doing those basic things, right? And then their testimony starts kind of, just it hinges on something that may have happened 10, 15 years ago now because they haven't experienced anything powerful enough to keep them going.
Right.
So, but in terms of your question, yeah, I would say there were a couple of things that happened. One of the first things that definitely added to that, the strength of my testimony, happened even before I got on my mission. It was literally like a month before, probably. Before you go on your mission, as you probably know, you have to get your patriarchal blessing. And so I went and got my patriarchal blessing. And at the very beginning of my patriarchal blessing, it's not word for word here, but it basically what the patriarch said in the prayer was, on this beautiful morning, we're here to grant you the desires of your heart. And at this time, you will feel within you a power that is um, most strong and which is difficult to describe, but will let you know of the nearness of our Father in heaven to you. And as soon as he said that, I felt this unbelievable power that just enveloped me. And I couldn't, like, if I had had to talk at that point, I don't know that I could have said anything. I felt like just, very, very powerful, good, right? Like a warm, powerful meaning, but it just overpowered me, and I could only listen and just continue to listen through the rest of the prayer. And so every time I go back and look at that patriarchal blessing, I always remember that event because that was a very powerful, powerful moment there where I felt the spirit in a way that I had never felt it. And very, very much as he said, I felt the closeness of Heavenly Father to us, So that really helped me. And then there were two other incidents on my mission in particular. I mean, there are many different things that happened, but one of them in particular was, and this one's a weird one because a lot of people probably don't experience this, but soon after arriving on my mission, probably within 4 or 5 months, I was a district leader. And then within probably another couple of months, I was a zone leader. And that was probably because I was language wise, I was well ahead of everybody. So maybe that made me more of a senior missionary amongst the 16 Spanish missionaries. And so I had the opportunity as a district leader and a zone leader to do a lot of the interviews for baptisms, not
Right.
people that I had taught necessarily, but others, right? And so this is really interesting because I had this one gentleman, and again, I'll never forget this powerful evening. And I was asked to come and interview him, and his name was Manuel Anguiano. And I didn't know him. I had never met him. So I sat with him and we began to talk about his experience with the missionaries. And it turned out that, he had probably gone through like 5 or 6 different sets of missionaries over 5 years. His wife was a member of the church. His kids were members of the church, but he was the only holdout. And he went through over a number of experiences that had kind of led him to accept the church. And it was really interesting to me how it didn't just happen in one fell swoop. It happened with a whole bunch of different little things that happened. Certain members of the church had something to do with it. The missionaries had something to do with it. Something else may have happened to his life. His wife had a lot to do with it. And all these things slowly came together to convince him of the truthfulness of the gospel. And it was a very, very powerful, powerful evening. Like when we sat there and talked, I could really feel the spirit. I didn't even want to stop talking to him, but we finally finished. And it was ridiculous because we had gone 3 hours, 3 hours talking to this man. Usually those interviews are like half an hour to 45 minutes, right? In fact, the missionaries that were waiting, that were out in the living room waiting, they were starting to wonder if there was something going on that was wrong, right? Like, maybe he's not going to get baptized. Maybe he discovered something wrong. But that was a very powerful, powerful evening. And again, it helped me feel, the powerful testimony that he had, but also the spirit. And then there was another one with, there was a sister who had learned from the missionaries, again, several missionaries over the years about the church. I mean, she probably knew the discussions inside out. We had stopped teaching her in terms of, we pretty much gone through everything we could teach you. We were just visiting her from time to time. And on this one instance, this one evening, her name was Maria Lopez. We visited her in her brother's home. They weren't members of the church, and they weren't they didn't have any desire to be members, but they weren't, against the church, and they liked the missionaries, so they would invite us over. So on this one night, we went over, and there was 3 of us actually. We were in a threesome, myself and 2 other missionaries, and we had kind of decided going into this that we need to kind of put out the challenge, and if not, then I don't know that we're going to continue to just keep visiting for the heck of visiting, right? But we didn't really know what we were going to say or do. We just kind of went into it that way, right? We figured, all right, we'll just see how this goes. Anyway, I don't even remember how this happened, but we ended up discussing faith. And one of my companions, a really dear friend of mine who I became very, very close to, his name was David Marlowe from Atlanta. And he brought up section 32, or sorry, Alma 32. in the Book of Mormon, and we went through and we analyzed, the seed, right? That Alma talks about, how we need to have just an ounce of faith, right? And even if it's as small as a seed, if we plant it in our hearts and we feed it with faith and prayer, it'll grow just like a good seed will grow in good soil, and it will become stronger and stronger. And before you know it, it's no longer a seed, it's a tree that is very strong and powerful. Of course, symbolism for your testimony. And so we went through that whole thing, and the three of us had not planned what we were going to say, but we just kind of went with it. And the Spirit really led us to talk and bring out certain principles and draw out specific principles with verses in that chapter. And by the time the whole thing was said and done, we were probably there an hour and a half. We committed her to be baptized. She had no doubts that she needed to be baptized because there was nothing else that she could learn. But that night she felt the Spirit so powerfully, and within a week or so we had a baptism, and it was wonderful. But for us, again, it was a very powerful event for the three of us as missionaries, because we were definitely led by the Spirit. We didn't know what we were going to say to her. We kind of knew that we needed to sort of put our foot down and say, okay, this is it, right? Get baptized, or we may not see you as much as you saw us before, right? So yeah, so those are a couple of probably instances where definitely, again, the Book of Mormon was our number one tool for teaching on our mission. Our mission presidents, I had two, because the first one left after about a year. He had just finished his third year, and then the new one came in. So both of them were very, very strong believers that your number one tool is the Book of Mormon, and that you need to use the Book of Mormon all the time. And of course, the discussions are still designed to the Book of Mormon to be used, and it's central, right? Because the idea is, if you accept the Book of Mormon, it's key to everything else, right? If you gain a testimony of the Book of Mormon, you gain a testimony of Joseph Smith. You gain a testimony of Joseph Smith, now you have a testimony of the restoration and everything else that goes with it. So it just makes sense. And that again,
yeah.
yeah.
From my experience, I actually, in the reverse, in a lot of ways, is I discovered Joseph Smith as a prophet of God first, and then it was at least 15 years later, if not 20 years later, did I really get a confirmation of the Book of Mormon being
Right.
true by the Spirit. And so one or the other. You got to
Yeah, no, it's one or the other.
There's got to
Yeah.
be, and so the Lord is not, he understands. I know he knows our nature and what makes us move towards him and what makes us go away from him.
Yeah. Yeah. I think eventually most people have to have a testimony of the Book of Mormon. If someone doesn't have a testimony of the Book of Mormon and they don't read it regularly, I find that's kind of a dangerous place to be, because, you know, the constant reading of the Book of Mormon, I think, just keeps you really close and helps build and fortify your testimony. It doesn't mean you can't get a testimony from the New Testament or from the Old Testament, but there is a power that comes from the Book of Mormon that does not come from the other books, and it's probably because it's very distinctive, it's very different, and it's what sets us apart, and sets the Church of Jesus Christ apart from all the other denominations.
I want to add, I've read it 5 times maybe. The last time I read it was actually listening to it, and I caught a few things while I was listening to it that I didn't catch when I was reading it. And I wanted to see if you noticed them. In the Lord's Prayer in the Book of Mormon, it goes this way: Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy will be done. It doesn't in the Bible, and there's this idea that Joseph Smith copied and pasted from the 1768 version of the Bible. But
Right.
in that Bible, it says, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be
Right.
done. The Book of Mormon leaves out thy kingdom come.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever catch that before?
No, I haven't. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. I just caught it the last time we were studying it.
Yeah.
The other
But
nuance. Oh, go ahead, please. Please.
just before you go to the other one, I would say
Oh, there's a
that
lot of them.
yeah, I would say that that's not unlike the sections in Second Nephi from Isaiah, right? Where there are some slight differences. It's not a direct cut and paste. And that to me just tells me that, we know that the Old Testament has been translated more than a few times, and there's different translations of it. The wording is different depending on which version of the Bible you have. Uh, I just think that, the Lord revealed to Joseph what the revelation needed, or what the verses needed to be
Right,
for what we needed today, right?
right.
And people will say, well, this is basically the same thing. No, it's not exactly the same. But at the same time,
It's a parallel, but not,
right. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
the Old Testament. It is a parallel only.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I mean, the Lord decided to teach the same thing to the
Yeah.
Nephites that he had taught the people in the old world. So why wouldn't he use essentially the same wording?
Yeah. And here's another one that I caught. Again, I'm talking to you because you're so well read in it that I've discovered these things, and the other thing that I caught recently was in the story of Mormon and Moroni, as Mormon is editing the plates and doing all the editing of everything from it's edited from Jacob, or is it edited from Mosiah? I think it's edited from Mosiah, isn't it?
From Messiah on, yeah,
Up
is where
to
he's
all the way
editing
to where he starts his book, his
at
and
the end of Fourth Nephi.
right. And as you can see in the life of Mormon and how he's able to do all this editing up to third Nephi, and all of a sudden the story kind of fades off into the abyss almost. Like
Mhm.
there's no the whole nature of the book changes dramatically,
Yeah.
and I think that, in my opinion, this shows the authenticity of the book, because if Mormon is young and he's able to do a lot of this work, and then when the wars come up, now
Mhm.
it's just get the most important things in there as fast as I can without giving all the illustration I did
Hmm.
in the.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Because it's to me, Third Nephi is undramatic, under dramatic at best,
sure. Well,
but it's
yeah,
important, but it's under dramatic.
well, yeah, and it's also a time period where, you're the very beginning of Third Nephi is not a great time for the Nephites. There's a lot of
Right.
destruction and a lot of evil, and that evil is removed through destructions of, you know, actual earthly destruction, and storms and earthquakes and that kind of thing. But the rest of the Third Nephi is basically a good story, right? Like, not good story, but good news. It's all, Christ's visit and his gospel, and so there's no war, there's no contention at that point. And in fact, the Nephites lived for 3.5 generations at probably the highest level known to man, besides probably the people of Enoch, right?
Right.
They're probably right up there. It's just that they weren't translated, but it does say that, there was never a happier people upon the face of the earth as those Nephites in those 3.5 generations. So yeah, all of a sudden now, that story ends in Fourth Nephi, and what's next? Well, now you're in sort of at the present with Mormon,
Right.
and we know that his time period is not the greatest, right? I mean,
Yeah.
today, after having read the Book of Mormon a number of times, when I first started, the very first time I read that Book of Mormon, as I mentioned, on the buses back and forth as I was trying to gain my first testimony, the story that sort of clung to me was the story of the sons of Mosiah and their missionary efforts, and particularly Ammon. And
Yeah.
maybe that's because
Evan's
I
my
was
man.
about, yeah, yeah, and maybe that's because I was about to go on a mission, and so that story really grabbed me as someone who was about to go on a mission. And wow, these guys left everything behind, and look at what they encountered, and all that kind of stuff, right? And so that was kind of like my favorite story in the first few years that I was reading the Book of Mormon. Over the years, then Nephi really became a person that really spoke to me for many, many different reasons. But to this today, I would say that my favorite individual in the Book of Mormon is Mormon.
Yeah.
I love Mormon like no other prophet in the Book of Mormon because first of all, I think he lived at a time that's very similar to ours, right? Everything around him was falling apart spiritually. There were not too many people left that were willing to live, a righteous lifestyle. And people were doing had turned to many perverted things, and yet he was asked to somehow lead his people into battle, and from a very young age, right? When he had gone through some very, very powerful experiences, even seeing Christ. So he's an amazing person to me. I mean, someone that I really look up to, and someone who, as you said, at that point in time, yeah, the Book of Mormon goes from a very happy period in Third Nephi and Fourth Nephi to all of a sudden, oh, geez, now we're kind of in reality here, back to the real life of a world that is not very, very good, a world that's not very different from ours, and how he manages it, right? And I can't help but think that he knew he wasn't going to be writing much more. He had obviously finished most of the translation. All that was left was whatever he wanted to add. And so he does his best to provide, some additional insights and teachings. Um, and then, of course, hands everything over to his son, who then adds a few more things in his own book and in the book of Ether, because he still had time and the Lord directed him to do so. But yeah, I really think Mormon is a person whose life most resembles ours today, right? Because um, he he was among the few that were righteous, and we are still among the few, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
He's
I always use a scripture in Jacob 5, and it's verse 70. And Jacob 5 is that, the chapter of the allegory of the wild and tame olive trees,
right.
which confuses people to no end. But essentially, it's an allegory of the scattering of the house of Israel and how it's brought back together. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. But in verse 70, it says, "And it came to pass that the Lord of the vineyard sent his servant, and the servant went and did as the Lord had commanded him, and brought other servants, and they were few." So this is referring to the last time that the Lord brings together the good olive trees and tries to organize, everything, which is symbolic for the latter days, right? The last time that the Lord will bring his people, collect the house of Israel, and try to separate the good and the bad. And what I like about that verse is that it basically says that, the Lord instructed his servant, which would be like the prophet, and the prophet or his servant went and got other servants to help him, which represents, leaders of the church and represents us, everybody, right? We go out because the church can't operate on just a few individuals. We need each other, and everybody has responsibilities to help, move the gospel forward. But then what I like is that the very last line says, "And he brought others, servants, and they were few." Okay. So, sometimes we talk about how the church is growing and it's growing, but you know what? At the end of the day, we are very few still. It's a very small number.
7 point whatever billion people in the world, and there's a little trinket of and I
Yeah.
think that it goes along with the idea that we are the elect.
Hmm.
Not to be boastful about that, but
No.
for
Yeah.
those who this is, I told my wife a long time ago. She always harassed me about this idea. I said, "This is a hard life. If you don't,"
Yeah.
I always philosophize this way, and I think it goes along with uh, John's writings. And it's if you love it, it's kind of parallel. If you love the law, you'll love the creator of that law. If you
Hmm.
hate the law, you'll hate the creator of that law. And so
Right.
you can't be in an organization such as this and be in or out. You have to be all the way in or all the way out, because
Yeah.
it's very hard to manage the middle in this place.
Yeah.
So that's why
And
we're very few.
yeah. And in fact, when you look at the total membership, the reality is that the total membership is really, when you actually count those that are active in the church and, are maintaining themselves at a level where they're trying to progress. That's an even smaller number,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So it's really, really a small. When it says few, it is really few, right? And back to your point there about, it's not an easy um, commitment, right? An easy commitment to me is, you know, if you're in a church or a religion where you're asked to go once a week and you go for an hour, you sit there, you listen, you go home, and that's it, and you're done, right? And you've done what you're supposed to do. That is much simpler to do. Uh, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints requires us to do a lot, right? And I'm the first one to admit I fall short many times, right? I don't give enough
Preach to
time
the
to what I'm
choir,
supposed to
preaching
do.
to the choir.
Yeah, I mean, you get lost in your worldly things and family and work and everything, and then you're tired and you're not giving as much as you should, right? But despite all of that, despite all of those challenges, right? I guess it's like Nephi says, right? When the very first verse in the Book of Mormon, right? And people always memorize the first part, which is I, Nephi, haven't been born of goodly parents, right? That's the part everybody remembers. But the second part is even more important because he says, and having seen many afflictions in the course of my days, nevertheless, having been highly favored of the Lord in all my days. And I wonder, how many afflictions do we have? Well, I think all of us have many afflictions. And do we still consider ourselves highly favored of the Lord?
Yeah,
Despite
that's
those, as Nephi did. Right.
yeah,
That's
that's very
the
important.
test.
So I wanted to go back a little bit on that conversation about Mormon and absolutely. For one, I wanted to point out when you read Mormon and that experience he's having in war,
Hmm.
you can't invent that. You
Yeah.
I don't there's I look at I try to step out of the religion and I try to analyze the how Joseph Smith is writing these things.
Hmm.
And I'm like I said, one of the things that I noticed is how Third Nephi drops off, and then all of a sudden you have Mormon who's writing all this stuff. But why isn't it that Third Nephi becomes the grandeur of all things, and then finish it off with riding off into the sunset kind of
Yeah.
thing?
Right. Sure.
Because that would be
That would
that
be a
would be
good
the
way to end
best
it.
ending.
Sure. Yeah.
And but yet it doesn't end that way. And like I
No.
said, Joseph Smith, if he's trying to invent this book, doesn't do a very good job of making a very good ending.
Doesn't have a
You
good
know what I
ending at
mean?
all, actually.
It's
No.
it's it's like it really goes away from the normalcy of trying to invent a book that's supposed to be a lure for those
Hmm.
who are seeking a different religion.
Yeah. No,
It's,
it doesn't have a good ending, right?
no,
Obviously, you have to read
well, it just
through
falls
that,
off
and
in
right.
its attachment to the characters
Hmm.
within the book. You
Yeah.
get reattached to Moroni and you get reattached to Mormon, but
Hmm.
you don't have the same kind of attachment that you do to Ammon,
Right.
to Captain Moroni,
Mhm.
to
Well,
Pelion and Korihor and Alma
sure.
himself and like
Plus, I think when you're reading it at this point, and after you've read it the first time, you know what's coming. So
yeah,
by the time you get to that part of the Book of Mormon, you know that this is it. This is the end. I'm in the final chapter of the book, but also the final chapters of the Nephite civilization, and it's
yeah,
not good from here on in, right? So, I think it might be a temptation to just read through those final two books and it's like, okay, well, I already know what's going to happen here. They're all going to be destroyed, and then Moroni is going to tell us to, when you receive these things, pray and ask the Lord to reveal the truthfulness of it unto you, and that's it. But there's so much doctrine in those final chapters and books that I really think that both Mormon and Moroni probably struggled with what to include because they had to know like this is the end, right? Like what am I supposed to tell here? How much should I get into here with and especially Mormon, I think, really struggles when he sees the horrific things that are happening around him
yeah,
and he tries to describe them in a way that is not too descriptive, right? Because he even, I think, tries to correct himself by not getting into it in too much detail because we're talking about all sorts of atrocities, right, between men and women,
yeah, yeah.
and so he doesn't want to get into that detail, but he also doesn't want to leave us without the realization of what's happening
Yeah.
around him. So I think he must have really struggled to how much do I say? How much do I want to get into? This is horrible time. he had to know that this was not a good
Yeah.
feel good book, right? His account was not going to be a feel good situation.
Right,
So he had to
right.
make the most of it. But it shows us how you can live in a really dark world spiritually and still keep going, right? Because he didn't give up. I mean, he did step away from his military duties for a while because he refused to lead them.
Yeah.
Because he says that they had fallen so far apart from the Lord that he just refused to guide them. But then he felt bad for them later. Again, even though he knew the final, that is so difficult, I think, for us to conceive, right? Like he knew what was going to happen, right? And so did Moroni, for that
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah.
And yet they could have just stepped away and said, no, you know what? I don't want to be a part of this. You're going to be destroyed anyway. No, he went ahead and did what he could to try to probably save as many as he could along the way.
So I got a question for you while we're on the
Hmm.
subject of Moroni. Just see where your head is.
Sure.
Are you did Moroni carry the plates from
Uh,
South America to
right,
the Hill Cumorah in North America, or are you a North American
right.
Nephi, Hopi, or Hopewell Indian?
Hopewell. Yeah,
Hopewell.
Hopewell and the Adean
Yeah.
civilizations, right? Yeah, I think up until just the last year or two, I didn't really have a preference. I understood both theories, but it just happened that in the last year or so, I started really getting into some of the work of
Wayne May.
yeah, Wayne May and all of that Hopewell stuff and the Adean, which is
Crazy,
even
isn't
earlier.
it?
And I really do think now that there's much more of a case to be made for the North American
Yeah.
lands like Ohio, Missouri, Pennsylvania, that part of the world, New York being really where the Nephites were settled, right? Because we always know there's references to a land of many waters, right? And I like how he describes that narrow neck of land because people always interpret the narrow neck of land as oh, there's the center of Central America and all that kind of
Panama.
stuff, right?
It
Yeah,
was right there.
yeah. But then I always wondered as a kid, like, well, wait a minute, if that's what they're talking about, how do you walk these distances? Like, they're not talking about massive distances, right? And so then how did we end up with the plates all the way up in New York? Did Moroni walk all the way from Central America to New York? It's possible, I guess. Nothing's impossible, but no, I think I'm actually of the mind that my own theory is that I think there's probably more proof of it being in that North American part of
And
the world.
I've been changed for a long time myself.
Yeah.
Listening to Wayne May and and
Hmm.
looking at what he said about the land of promise, and there would
Yeah.
never be a king upon the land. There's
Hmm.
such and there's just so much. But in the end, it's not whether I'm going to find Zarahemla or
Right.
Nephi or anything like that when it comes to my conviction to the Book of Mormon or Joseph
Yeah.
Smith prophetic calling.
Mhm.
It is only by the Spirit. I'm sorry, it's
Yeah.
only by the Spirit that you will really know of these things. I'm going to go back to your first experience where the patriarchal blessing.
Hmm.
Believe me, I've had one of those experiences, and it was not prompted by anything. I came home, I was watching BYU channel. The person giving the lecture said that quoted the verse out of the Doctrine and Covenants, the field is white, ready for harvest. Unbelievable. I could not, like you said, couldn't speak. I was there sobbing.
Hmm.
I was scared to death, but I
Hmm.
was feeling the warmth of God in its entirety.
Right.
And sure enough, 3 days later, a woman came to my doorstep with her granddaughter, and because we were who's my ex-wife now, she was going to watch the child, and the child's 9 years old, and and we started talking, and she happens to be black, this lady and her daughter or granddaughter, and we're talking, and my brother was getting married in the temple that day, and I wasn't able to go in the temple at the time, but I was going to go meet him after.
Hmm.
And so we started talking, and I said, well, we got to go to the temple. She says, you're a Mormon? I said, I am. That was before I figured out the Latter-day Saint thing
Hmm.
20 years ago. But um, she says, I'm a Mormon too, and I've been waiting to go back, but I didn't have. I've been out for 13 years, and I didn't know have anybody to go back with. And that lady, she died, a faithful member, temple endowed member. The daughter got baptized. She brought at least 10 or 15 of her uh, relatives into the church at the same time,
Oh, wow.
and they all got baptized. Yeah. So
Yeah,
was the field white and ready for harvest?
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's you have something like that in your life, like you've had.
Mhm.
You don't just idly say, "Yeah, the church is true," because there's
Yeah, no,
more
you
to
have
it
to
than
have those
just that.
experiences,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
And you,
I've had so many experiences I don't even,
yeah,
it's hard to
that's right. You
count.
stop counting, and they're not all massive, right? Like there's a
Yeah.
few massive ones maybe that everybody remembers, but you have to
Right.
have small ones too, right? Like when you read the Book of Mormon, there's always all this knowledge and revelation and insights that I discover, and it's like it's the Lord opening up your mind to something, right?
Mm.
And sometimes you surprise yourself of what's in there, even though you've read it so many times. And but at the end of the day, you have to have that testimony. You can't just rely on somebody else. Otherwise, yeah, you probably won't be able to get by a lot of the challenges in life, unfortunately.
So how do you feel about do you know the name Daniel Peterson?
Rings
Uh,
a bell,
he
but
does he's in charge of the Interpretive Foundation. They just put out a movie a couple of years ago called The Witnesses.
mhm. Okay,
Uh,
yeah.
have you watched that,
I
or do you know
I
anything
can't
about it?
remember if I've watched it. It sounds like something I've watched, but I'd have
Yeah.
to have a quick
Or
look to see if I've seen it. I've seen
so
so
the
many
question
things.
so the question I'm asking is really goes to this: how does the witnesses to you fit into your? Is that a major thing for you to have so many of Joseph Smith's companions to be a part of the witnessing of the process of the Book of Mormon?
Of the Book of Mormon. I'll be honest with you. I've probably read those witnesses, the three witnesses and the eight witnesses, along with the Book of Mormon many times, but I've never really my testimony has never hinged on them,
Yeah.
and I've also found it a bit strange. you know, I get the idea that these individuals have basically given their testimony, they've given their name, they've sealed their, in some cases, they've given their life to the church. Others left the church, right? But they've never denied the testimony that they gave. And so all of that I understand. But at the end of the day, it's probably because I always envisioned that I had to have my own testimony, regardless of what these eight people and three others said. I had to have my own, and then that was what I was going to hinge it on. I wasn't going to let my testimony rest on, you know, eight and three
Right.
testimonies, right? But it's good to know. It's good to see that these individuals are there, but I've never really let that be the basis for me. It wouldn't be enough for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can understand that. For
Yeah.
me, I use it as you probably know that I do a lot of this stuff proselyte or not. I don't
Yeah.
proselyte. I just talk to
Yeah.
people because
Sure.
it's just something that I'm passionate about.
When
Uh,
someone doesn't know anything, yeah, you're right. It's a good introduction to the fact that, hey, this isn't just, me saying this. There's a number of individuals who have actually, signed their name and given their testimony of seeing the plates and the angel and everything else. So it's interesting to someone who's probably experiencing the church and the Book of Mormon for the first time. Right.
so,
But there, I look at it because I think about the number of things that we just don't know, right? There's a lot of things that we just don't know in the church. And a lot of times, when people who are trying to pick holes in the church, they'll ask questions and often we have answers. It may not be the answers that they want, but we have answers. But I remember a number of years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I went to this event it was a stake event where there was a general authority speaking, and I can't remember his name. And it wasn't a Sunday; it was like a Saturday afternoon, and it was question and answers with this general authority. And what they did is they actually prepared all these questions, and it was kind of like a quiz. So they read out all these questions. There was like 20 questions, and we were supposed to keep our own answers, right? And the answers were always, you had, it was multiple choice, and the multiple choice was always the same. It was always true, false, or we don't know. And what was amazing to me was that after we did these 15, 20 questions, the majority of answers to these questions were, we don't know. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff that we don't know, right? We just don't know. And we have to, unfortunately or fortunately, take it by faith and know that the Lord will probably explain it to us someday. It may make sense to us at some point, right? But we don't know. Like somebody said to me recently, like if you guys made the change recently to 2 hours, and you knew you were going to go to 2 hours, why didn't you just make the change to 2 hours like 20, 30 years ago? Why did you have to go through this process of going to church 3 different times a day, which is what I remember doing when I
I
was a
remember
kid?
that too.
Yeah. And then you went to the 3 hour block, and now you're at a 2 hour block. Why didn't you just go all the way to the 2 hour block from the very restoration of the church, right? If God knows everything, why didn't you just go right to that model? Well, the answer to that is I don't know. I don't know why. The Lord had a reason for us to go to church 3 different times, and then it became a 3 hour block, and now it's a 2 hour block. And I don't know, will it be a 1 hour block one day? I don't know. But we just don't know the answers to these things, right? And of course, you can get into other topics, more hotly debated topics, right? Like the priesthood, the extension of the priesthood to the blacks. And if you ask me, I don't know, right? That's one of those where I do not know why it took that long. I don't know, honestly. And there's a great paper that was written. I'll send it to you if you've never seen it by
Appreciate it.
the son of Spencer W. Kimball. And or sorry, was it son? I think it was a son. Yeah, son or brother. I think it was a son actually. And it's available through BYU. It's a really well written document where there's all the detail there that most people don't know about what happened, how we got to that point, and then how we got to 1977, where the priesthood was finally extended to all worthy males. And it's absolutely enlightening. It's absolutely unbelievable. But it also taught me one thing as I read through that document, and I'll share it with you. Number one is that sometimes the Lord lets us dictate the path on our own. He doesn't always tell us where we need to go, but that means we might go the wrong way,
Yeah.
right? And then he'll correct us and he'll bring us back, right? And I think a lot of things happened, right, at that time, from the time of the restoration to the 70s. And decisions were made by men, natural men, humans who don't have perfect knowledge of everything. And they did what they could. And there were social influences, cultural influences that affected everything. But yeah, were there mistakes made? Probably. This document certainly adds a lot of light to that. And it's really quite interesting, the experiences of Spencer W. Kimball, David O. McKay, and other presidents who struggled with it from early on. This isn't something that just became the topic in 1975, 76. It was there for many, many decades, right? So it really gave me a really good understanding, appreciation for how difficult of a decision that was, right? And again, why didn't the Lord just reveal this to Joseph Smith from day one? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I know my brother and others have raised this, which is a very valid point, that when the church was restored in 1830, think about what the country was like back at that day, right? Think about the South. Think about the difference between the South and the North. And the church was already under a lot of stress, being very different, right? Of course, they had difficulties moving into Ohio, later much more into Missouri.
Missouri.
So add another level of grace, and I don't know, maybe it would have made things almost impossible for the church at that time. I don't know, and that's just a theory, right, by men. One day, I guess we'll know for sure why the Lord decided and waited until 1977. But there's also some stories in that book or in that chapter of some very valiant members of the church, males in particular, black males, who stuck it out and were members of the church. And I cannot even imagine the faith that those men had to have to be members of a church where they were not able to hold the priesthood. Because if you said that to me, I would probably be the first one out the door. Right? I'd say, well, this isn't fair. I'm out of here then. Right? And yet there's so many men who stuck it out. Right? They were faithful.
And
They didn't.
they're not what would you say, people that we use as symbolic.
Right.
We look at these as great men, as
Hmm.
being better than most of us in their conviction to the
Yeah.
gospel.
Yeah. And they wouldn't have known any more than we have, right? Like nobody knew. It's not like all of a sudden, because I've heard their testimonies and of some of them, and they didn't know either, right? They didn't know. That didn't make sense to them. It's not like they got a revelation that, okay, everything's going to be okay. Don't worry about it. You'll get the priesthood. They weren't sure if it was even going to happen in their lifetime. And
Right,
in fact,
right.
I heard a gentleman the other day on a YouTube channel, and he was giving his testimony, and he said, I was convinced, based on something that I think Elder Bruce R. McConkie had said, that I wouldn't get the priesthood until the
I
millennium.
think I just watched that one. It was
Yeah.
he would talk about he was joined in 1972,
Yeah. Right.
and he went with the BYU.
Hmm. Yeah. The
He said,
ambassadors,
"I can't
BYU
be a
ambassadors.
missionary because he
That's
wrote
right.
the prophet
Because he didn't have the
twice."
priesthood. Well, he didn't have
He
the
says,
priesthood.
"I can't
Yeah.
go on a mission, but yet the women could go on a mission." And
Right. And the
he
young
said,
ambassadors.
"Well, they can get endowed." And he says, "Well,
Yeah.
fine." But then he joins the
The young
BYU,
ambassadors, BYU
yeah,
young
young
ambassadors.
ambassadors, yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. No, that kind of faith is unbelievable to me.
yeah,
Like that,
absolutely.
I feel this big when I hear those stories because I've had it easy compared to them, right?
Yeah,
And that gentleman was ready to live the rest of his life thinking that he was not going to have the priesthood until the millennium.
yeah.
And he had accepted it, and he probably figured one day I'll understand. But he had a testimony, and you can't deny that, right? He did end up with a testimony aside from the fact that he couldn't hold the priesthood. It's an amazing story to me, seriously.
Because again, my relatives are Elijah Abel. I
Mhm.
have on my mom's side, I have plenty of black relatives today from marriages. Uh, and then I have my dad's side. There was my great grandfather. He married a black woman, had or was having children by a black woman.
Mhm.
So I have plenty of reason to, in my heart, that idea of them being withheld doesn't sit well with me.
No, no, right, yeah.
It never does. It's
Mm.
hard uh, to to ex, uh, to come to grips with that. But because of the foundation of the church being true
Yeah,
and all that it stands for, and the fact it was from God that the church was restored, I just say in time,
yeah.
I will. There might not be any answer that anybody could ever give that would ever convict them. Even God can't give them the answer.
Yeah, but
because
I think your
because it
point,
doesn't, no matter what we say or God says to them, it's uninviting.
yeah, and I think your point is really really good there, right? That it just didn't sit well, and it doesn't sit well with a lot of people to this day. When that topic comes up for discussion, obviously when you study the Doctrine and Covenants, you're going to get to it because the Doctrine and Covenants includes Declaration 1 and 2, and actually those are the two hottest topics in the church probably when it comes to why and why did this happen and why did it stop and everything, right? So you can't ignore them. You have to cover, as a gospel doctrine teacher, you have to cover Declaration 1 and 2,
Yeah,
right? You could skip over it, I guess, if you want, pretend it's not there, but reality is it's there. And if you're going to cover it, the questions are going to come up. And it's difficult. It doesn't sit well with you, yeah, as an individual, right? And I haven't had to go through it, but unfortunately, but for me too, it doesn't sit well. And I hope one day I can understand it better, but yeah, I'll send you the document and maybe we could chat about it at
oh
another
yeah,
day
absolutely.
because there's some amazing insights in that paper that was really well written. It's funny. There's a story in there about once it was close to being announced, uh, President Monson, although he was Elder Monson at the time, he's
Yeah,
still in the 12th. He went and had lunch. I think it was with the editor of the Deseret News, and he said to him, "I need you to hold the front page for Wednesday or something like this, right?" And he said, "Why? Is it a big story or something?" can you tell me anything, right? And he said, no, I can't tell you anything, but you'll know when you see it, when you'll see it, right? And sure enough, like, it was announced, and of course they were holding space in the front page, almost like the end of the war, World War II, that kind of an announcement that
Yeah, yeah,
goes big across the front of the newspaper.
yeah. There's again, there's we and reading the Book of Mormon, that the black skin comes up and
Yeah,
things like that. And
yeah,
and I just had a discussion with another friend of mine who's an anti, just hates that
yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
But we we have to understand that Lord deals with us based on what He thinks is best for us.
Hmm.
It's not because He's trying to uh, 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 tear us down in the way to completely destroy us, but He's trying to tear us down to a point where we can be built back up to the right. And that idea
Yeah,
that may and I had this idea, and I think it's works in some ways, but it's not the mind of the Lord; it's the mind of AJ. Okay,
sure. Hmm.
it's he he allows this thing about the priesthood and the blacks and all these other things that go, the nuances go on with that to a point so that we as members today are intolerant of that attitude.
Hmm.
We we would never look at our brothers and sisters in Africa or anywhere else that have a darker skin than we and look at them for me or for you. It
Sure. Yeah.
seems like, and I don't want to judge anybody or make this like a broad brush across everybody. But I think mostly the people in the church don't look at, we don't discriminate because we don't want, because we are we feel that wrath always of
Sure.
being the church of of segregation within the priesthood.
Yeah. And I mean, the church now is global, right? Like it's all over
Yeah,
the place. The face of the church is very different, right, from what it was back in the 50s and 60s, where it was basically white men and white women with blonde hair. Often, that was kind of the face of the church. The face of the church now is, it's all over the place, right? It's blacks. There's a lot of members in the church in Africa now. Parts of African countries like Ghana are just growing like crazy.
yeah,
Philippines, huge, one of the largest, the most spoken languages in the church outside of English is languages spoken in Philippines. So yeah, it's, the church is certainly global now. And which is the way it should be, right? Because
right.
we're all sons and daughters of the same God who created us very differently and allowed us to evolve over time because of just the way humans mix differently, right? And but yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing now. But yeah, one of those things that's kind of often difficult to understand. I'll tell you one thing that helped me understand it. And definitely, this document is very helpful. But
Yeah.
one thing that helped me at a more less academic uh, way is last year's study of the Old Testament. And you have to go back to basically the very beginning, right, with Adam and Eve and Abel and
Who's
Cain.
cursed?
Exactly, yeah. Because people get that whole curse thing completely wrong, right? They believe that the curse is the skin color. That wasn't the curse. If you go back and you study that part of the Old Testament, it's very clear. And fortunately, the Pearl of Great Price adds a little bit of insights there. But the curse was that because he killed his brother, he basically gave up the rights to the priesthood and any blessings that came through the priesthood that he would have been entitled to hold, right? The reason the color of the skin was put on Cain was because you'll recall that he said, well, I won't be able to go anywhere now. People will know that I killed my brother and they'll come after me and this and that. And so the Lord changed the color of his skin to actually protect him and identify him so that others would know that if they were to do something to him, that there would be a repercussion for that, right? But people get confused and they say, oh, the curse was the skin color. No, the curse wasn't that. The curse was not being able to hold the priesthood and gain the blessings
Which
that
was
came
just
with
brought
it.
up to me by again my friend who I put a video out of him,
Hmm.
me and him. I haven't put that one out yet. I
Yeah.
put the first half, but it we go into that idea, and I just learned that from him and didn't
Yeah.
realize it. But do you think that that skin of blackness in the Book of Mormon becomes? I know that we try to swim around and try to what would you say, PC it.
Hmm.
But do you think because of what happened in the story of Cain and how he was hands off kind of thing,
Yeah.
that God could have uh, the skin color of the Lamanites were done in the same idea that they would
Yeah,
understand there's a
I think
hands
there's,
off kind of thing?
yeah, I look at it two different ways. The first one would be that more of a literal translation. Certainly, the Lord tells Nephi to leave his brethren, right, and to move on. They get to a point where they can no longer cohabitate, right? I mean, how many times have Laman and Lemuel tried to essentially kill their brother? And it comes to a point where obviously they've had enough opportunities and they're not going to ever change. And so the Lord basically tells Nephi and his people, the believers, go. Okay, and so they go to the north, and they basically separate themselves. And it's at about that time that that distinction occurs, right? But there's also you know a number of verses, and I'd have to look them up, where it's very clear too that they became a loathsome and I don't know if the word that's used is dark, but it may be, people. And that's because of their own doings, right? They became involved in very dark works. And so that's more of a symbolic thing. It's not
There's a
necessarily
countenance there's a
right.
countenance of light and there's a countenance of darkness too
Exactly.
that
Right.
goes along with that.
Yeah.
Even though that we can say that okay, the Lamanites were their skin was turned dark, okay, fine,
Hmm.
but they lost that countenance of light because light comes from every believing, God fearing person in the world, no matter what the skin tone looks like.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so I think it's both. To answer your question, I think there is definitely a physical
Literal,
mark, but I think it's also a spiritual reference to
yeah.
their darkness in terms of their works, which then later goes away, right? Because when the at the time of Christ's
Well,
arrival to the
actually,
Nephites,
it's the sons of Ammon or Ammon and his people who start to bring the Lamanites into the light.
yeah,
I think that's
yeah,
a
no,
part
absolutely,
of that. Yeah, that
yeah,
transition.
yeah, definitely you have many Lamanites that become converted to the Lord. And so
Yeah,
you could say, well, I don't know if their skin was dark, I don't know that it would have changed, but definitely their works changed and they would
yeah,
have become more fair. And the
right.
word fair is used as in lighter, but spiritual lightness, right, unto the
Yeah,
Lord. And so obviously they separate themselves physically. They also, become very, very distinctive in terms of obeying the Lord to the point where I mean, I think the Ammonites became at times even more righteous than the Nephites themselves, right? So I think it's both, but definitely there is a time when the Lord comes, when Christ comes to the Nephites, where the righteous all come together and they become a very fair, again,
yeah.
spiritually people. And it tells us there that there were no more ites, right? There was no more differences, and they were all children of God and all considered the same.
Yeah. Here's an interesting concept. Now we haven't uh, Samuel the Lamanite. He comes out of nowhere.
Hmm.
Now it's my theory that he's actually an Ammonite
Could be, yeah, yeah,
because they were still a righteous people. They didn't. So I
yeah,
think that that could hold water a little bit. That he does come from that society. So now that we've talked about blacks and
that's a
whites,
good theory. I like that one actually. I've never thought of that, but I would agree. Yeah, I think Samuel Elamanite could very well have been either second generation, third generation from that original group of the Ammonites
yeah,
that were very much converted to the Lord.
yeah, I
Which
think
which
that's
would have been probably like the second generation would have been the sons of Helaman, that kind of group, right? which
Yeah.
fought with Helaman at his side because they hadn't made that covenant as their fathers had to not fight, to put their weapons down. So they took their weapons and decided, when things were going, when it was kind of obvious that they were in the Nephites were in a bit of a bind, they had to fight their way out of the Lamanite occupation. They stepped up. So yeah, maybe it's another generation or two after that. I'd have to take a look at the timing there in terms of how old Samuel would have been at that time. But yeah, I like that theory. He may have come from that line of people.
Yeah. Here's another thing that I found in the Book of Mormon. See, I don't read. I hate reading. Reading. I'm not good at it. I just passed my electrical test, so obviously I have to read something.
Yeah,
But
sure.
but here was something that I really challenge, especially members of the church, or I when I say my testimony, I'm a missionary first.
Hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, I say that I don't proselyte, but I beat the drum as loud as I can, and even told at work that by my HR, well, somebody complained that you boasted about your religion, and I said, well, I boast about about the company being the best thing ever too. So,
Right, sure.
it, you know what I mean? But there's a disconnect sometimes between how we present the Book of Mormon and the reality of it. I know that as a missionary, when you presented the Book of Mormon, it eventually you give them an opportunity to read these things made and that the Holy Spirit will confirm the truthfulness of it. And one of the things that I just caught again, I catch things is in that third verse. It says, "Behold, I would exhort you that when you shall read these things, if it be wisdom in God, if it
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
wisdom in God."
Right.
That's so critical. And
It
if we
is.
do
Yeah.
not present that in the right way, as you can read it, but it's upon God's uh, uh, agency whether He will provide that witness to you at the time or not. But if He
Yeah.
doesn't, so I think there's because it's so much we because I your experience as a missionary, I didn't go on a mission,
Mhm.
so I don't do things the same way as a missionary does. But as a missionary at the time, or since then, I'm sure you've been out with missionaries since then a lot. Do you feel like we overstate some things in the church as far as this thing about the Book of Mormon, and all you have to do is read it, and the Lord will present you with the
For the
will
testimony.
validate its truth.
Sure. Yeah, I think sometimes we oversimplify it. I found as a missionary that wasn't the case, right? That if I told people just read this and look, here's a verse and whatever, and read this and pray about it, it never worked. It never worked that way, because it's just not enough. Like, and now that I've read the Book of Mormon so many times, I realize, like, you really have to get into it. You can't just, like, look at a couple of verses here and there, go to the back where they told me there's a promise there, and then I don't think there's enough there for someone to be able to gain their testimony. They have to really get into it. And back to that verse that you were just quoting, I think that is the key verse in that promise, because when we refer to Moroni's promise, sorry, normally we refer to verse 4 and 5, right?
Yeah.
Which is the straight one. And when you shall receive these things, I would exhort you that you would ask God, the eternal Father, in the name of Christ, if these things are not true. By the way, it says, if these things are not true,
Could you
which I
explain
always,
that a little bit because it's confusing to me?
sure, I think it's almost like, to me, the way I interpreted that all the time was because I noticed that early on, right? It doesn't say that you ask in the name of Christ if these things are true, which is really what we tell people, right? We say to them, ask the Lord to tell you if these things are true. But really, what it says there is ask God, the eternal Father, in the name of Christ, right? Which is how we pray. Again, very, very accurate there, the way he's written it, right?
Right.
If these things are not true, right? And if so, to me, what that tells me is that Moroni already knows these are true. This is true. The
Okay.
Book of Mormon is
Okay. That
true,
makes sense.
right? So I'm
Yeah.
telling you it's true. But if you think it's not, ask God if it's not.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
that kind of way. Basically, it leads to the same answer, right?
Yeah.
But I just find it kind of interesting that, instead of saying,
He personally knows.
exactly, like he already has a testimony. I
Yeah.
know that the Book of Mormon is true. These things that I'm presenting to you here are true, but you ask if they're not true, right?
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course, if you ask, and these are the keys, that you have to have a sincere heart. You have to have real intention. I really want to know if this is true, right? And I have to have faith that God's going to reveal it and he'll manifest the truth of it unto me by the power of the Holy Ghost. And those are the key ingredients that people often don't have, right? They don't have a sincere heart. They're trying to, really prove that it's wrong, and they haven't done any work. They haven't read anything. They haven't, pondered anything that was presented to them.
I don't agree with that whole statement. And this is why.
Mhm.
Because a sincere heart doesn't walk away from discovery of truth. Again,
Right. Yeah.
15, 20 years later, I find out the Book of Mormon is true by the
Mhm.
Spirit. All right.
Yeah.
But I think some people with sincere hearts keep looking for that witness eventually.
Yeah. Right.
You know what I mean?
Yo,
Because you
absolutely.
can
Yeah.
because there's the plain and simple of what is true about the church is does it have the same organization
Mhm.
as the church in the time of Moses and Jesus Christ?
Right.
Absolutely. Does it have a temple? Yes, it does. Does it have the priesthood? There was I don't know if you ever listened to it or not, but 17 evidences of the true church of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I remember that.
And I can't, oh, what's his name? Anyway, and but they, it's kind of one of the things that you look at everything about the church. It's everything that it does is gives you a path to be successful in your relationship with God, in your relationship with your wife, in your relationship with your children, in your relationship when it comes to work, in a relationship when it comes to your interaction with your society.
Mhm.
What more could you ask of a church than that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Right. Which is, I mean, I always say that, just even if this church wasn't true, it still will prepare you to be a very good person in life
Yeah,
because of your relationship with everyone else if you follow the principles of it, right?
right.
But I mean, you're right. If you have a sincere heart and again, real intent, then you will do whatever you need to find the answer to something. And I remember a few years ago, I ran into someone who was dead set in proving, that the Book of Mormon wasn't true, that the Mormon Church and the gospel, the restoration of the gospel didn't take place, and Joseph Smith was a fake, et cetera, right? And I remember talking to this person and saying, well, why don't you, investigate the church, go to the missionaries, ask questions, find out as much as you can. It turned out that this person had a Book of Mormon, and I said, have you read the book? No, no, there's no way I'm reading that thing. So what this person did was they decided to use anti-Mormon literature, right, and a book written by an ex-member of the church who obviously had an axe to grind as the basis for learning what the church was about, which is ridiculous to me.
Yeah,
And I said to this person, I said, listen, if I wanted to know what you were all about, wouldn't I go right to you to find out who you are and what makes you tick and all that? Or should I go to someone that doesn't like you? Would that be a better picture of who you are?
yeah,
Obviously, it wouldn't, right? But it was amazing to me how the person didn't really show real intent and a sincerity to find out if this is really true. Because if you did, you'd go to the source. You don't go to secondhand sources of people who don't believe in something or have an axe to grind with you, right?
yeah.
So I think that,
Let me add to that a little bit. There's when I deal with atheists. Now, if I'm dealing you with an atheist person to person, there's no way not going to know there's a God. Online, it's a lot more difficult
mhm,
because it's just not personable enough.
right.
But and I've never been unsuccessful when it's person to person, given enough time. Um, but when they said when the challenge that I give them, at one time I wasn't an atheist, but I wasn't a believer either. In it because I didn't have a God that I walked uh, towards. I just
Right.
lived my life. All right. Um, Not agnostic, but again, when you don't have a God out in front of you and you don't acknowledge Him, you
Hmm.
know, then you become just the same as those who would call themselves atheist or agnostic.
Sure.
And so eventually I had to find my way back, or I wasn't even looking to come back. I was just doing it because my ex wanted to go back to the church. And I kind of like, well, I'm here and I figure 3 months and I'm out again. But
Yeah.
I really did. I really didn't have any, and I didn't, whatever, but things happen. And now you couldn't pry my dead hands off the pulpit, but the, I challenge them. I say, okay, I come from this world that you're talking about where there is no God for you. Then won't you take on the same path that I took on to discover the God that I did? Are you willing to do that? None of them do.
Right.
Because for me, I think that there's insincerity in their
Yeah.
language. Because if they really want to know if there's a God or not, then you walk towards that God that you're seeking.
Sure. Well, and I think that goes back to your question you asked earlier about the approach, missionary approach. That's where, as a missionary or as a normal member of the church who's possibly coming across someone, you have to make that judgment call. But normally, it's pretty easy to make. Like you can tell when someone is sincere and is asking sincere questions and showing curiosity versus someone who has showing no sincerity at all. In which case, you're probably not going to go anywhere with that discussion. It's not going to result in any conversion at that point, right?
Yeah, and I don't, and I'm not, and like I said, my approach when I talk to people is I don't, I just tell them the truth. It's a
Yeah.
LeGrand Richards kind of attitude. Just tell them what you
Hmm.
know, and tell them what we have to offer. And
Well, we
you
shouldn't.
know,
Yeah, we shouldn't be apologetic.
yeah,
We
just
often
tell them the
are,
truth.
right? Yeah. I just wanted to go back and go back to what you were talking about, though, in terms of Moroni's promise. And if you look at, I've got it in front of me here, but I don't know if you have it there. But if you look at the verses in chapter 10, if you actually start in verse 1,
Yeah, I got
chapter
it.
10, verse 1. Okay. So it starts with, Now I, Moroni, write somewhat as seemeth me good, and I write unto my brethren, the Lamanites. And I would that they should know that more than 420 years have passed away since the sign was given of the coming of Christ. So it's interesting because this chapter, he says here basically, I'm going to write to my brethren, the Lamanites. All right. We often read this chapter as though it was written for all of mankind, which of course it is. You can interpret, we're supposed to liken the scriptures unto ourselves. But it's interesting because Moroni actually writes this with his brethren in mind, right? Now, who are his brethren? The Lamanites. And what's happened to the Lamanites? They've already fallen. They've already
Yeah,
fallen away from the gospel. And he knows because he's read, the scriptures. He's read the plates, the record of the brother of Jared. So he's read what's going to happen in the future,
right.
as Nephi did too with his vision. And he knows that they're going to continue to fall away until the latter days when the gospel will be brought back to them. So this is why he wants to write to them specifically, right? And he's not talking about that, my brethren, the Lamanites that are around right now as I live. He knows that what he's doing is he's writing to the Lamanites in the 19th century, the ones that are going to be around when the restoration begins, right? And so then verse 2, he says, And I seal up these records, and I have spoken a few words by way of, after I've spoken a few words by way of exhortation. So then he goes into that discourse there where he exhorts us or he invites us. And then in verse 3, I like because he says, I would exhort you that when you shall read these things, if it be wisdom in God, which is the part that you were referring to, that ye should read them, that ye would remember how merciful the Lord God hath been unto the children of men from the creation of Adam, even down until the time that he shall receive these things, and ponder it in your hearts. There's so much in this verse, right, that we forget, right? First of all, the part that you raised, right, which is, I would exhort you that when you shall read these things, comma, if it be wisdom in God that you should read them, comma, that you would remember how merciful the Lord God hath been unto the children of men. So in other words, yeah, it's like you know, when you read these things, if it be wisdom and God that you should read them. In other words, just realize that this has come to you not just by mistake, right? That the Lord has brought this to you with an opportunity to read them, right? That there's more to this than just, oh, this is just something that landed on my desk, you know.
Yeah.
The importance of that whole thing, and then to remember how merciful God has been to all of the children of men. And I think the reason why that's important is because he's being merciful to the Lamanites in the latter days, right? Despite what the Lamanites did to annihilate their brethren, the Nephites, in 420 AD, the Lord is going to be merciful to them as he promised he would in the latter days. He would get the gospel back to them. So there's so many levels to that verse that, you know, before you even get to the when you shall receive these things, you know.
Kind of interesting. I want to something quite interesting. What you were just focusing on is the Lamanites and how you said something. I'm going to correct it just
Mhm.
because it's fun to correct. Would never have talked to somebody who's so scholarly, but anyway, uh, uh, wasn't that to me? And I want to make sure that I get this right too. The Lamanites didn't annihilate all of the Nephites. I thought the Nephites became coexistent with the Lamanites and became Lamanites themselves. Am I correct on that, or is that
Well, if you again, if you go back to the Book of Mormon,
right?
Mormon's book, right?
Right.
He's pretty clear there that there were, yeah, there was probably some that, you know, decided to go and live with the Lamanites. I don't know. There's not a lot of detail on those that would have
Right.
cut across, but those that remained faithful, I guess, to the cause of the Nephites, and by that I'm assuming either militarily they felt a duty to, you know, to fight for the Nephites versus abandoning the Nephites and going over to the Lamanites, or spiritually, right, connected
Right.
to the cause of the Nephites. So either one of those represents those that were still around at the time of that great final battle. And we know that 230,000 of those soldiers were killed, right? 23 leaders, or I don't know if they were generals or whatever, but they were at the head of 10,000 men. Okay. And each of those died with their 10,000. So we know that at least 230,000 died at that point in time. Now, were there women? Probably. Yeah, I don't think it was the women had disappeared completely. So what happened to the women? We don't have the details, right? They may have been killed later through other battles. They may have been killed during those battles, you know. So I think, yeah, there's probably some that did go across to become, you know, to live with the Lamanites,
Right.
but for the better part, I think they were basically, you know, killed off.
Annihilated.
Now, of
Annihilated.
course, you know, when I say they were annihilated by the Lamanites, yes and no. They brought it upon themselves,
Yeah.
right? Because if they had been righteous and had probably listened to Mormon and to Moroni, they would have lived much longer.
Yeah.
There wouldn't have been that issue. They probably would have seen something like what happened with Captain Moroni hundreds of years before, where despite being outnumbered, the Lord fought on their side and strengthened them and helped them win the battles that they should never have won.
Mm. Yeah.
I mean,
So
there's another great guy to study when you think about, you know, the great leaders in the Book of Mormon. And you know, you also wonder why so much of those chapters in Alma dedicated to war, right? And who wrote that though, right? Like who included that? Who was inspired to include that? Well, it was part of Mormon's
yeah. Yeah.
summary, right?
Yeah.
And who was Mormon? Well, he was a general,
Yeah.
and he was in the military from the time he was 16. He was placed at the front of the Nephite military at 16, which is ridiculous, right? Like, what kind of a great leader must he have been at that point that they felt he's our man, right? At 16.
Doesn't that remind you, just that story there, remind you of Joan of Arc?
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't
Oh,
that
yeah. Have you
incredible?
seen the talk? That there was a presentation by Jeffrey Holland about Joan of Arc. I'll send it to you. I'll see if I can find it. It was on
Okay.
YouTube,
Appreciate
and
it.
it's a great presentation by the church about Joan of Arc. Actually, I think it's not by the church, but by BYU.
Right.
And Elder Holland, who's one of my favorite speakers, he speaks about her, and he speaks about her faithfulness and her courage. And again, she was not a member of the church, obviously, but she had a lot of great convictions, and not unlike Mormon, not unlike other young individuals. Like you could add Joseph Smith to that too, because Joseph didn't have to fight a war, but he certainly had to fight a spiritual war where people
Yeah,
were coming at him
absolutely.
constantly. Right.
Well, there
So
was the wasn't there a war considered as there was a battle or kind of this thing they call a war in Missouri,
there were a number of battles. Yeah.
skirmishes and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
And of course, the church organized the Mormon battalion, right,
You're
which
right.
marched all the way to, I think, California, preparing for to help with the Spanish Mexican War, but
Right.
never got called into action. But it still helped. It helped. I don't know if you've ever been to San Diego and toured the actual church museum that the church
No,
has
I
there
haven't.
for the. Okay, if you ever go to San Diego, check it out. It's in old San Diego, the old part of San Diego,
Right.
and the church has a like a visitor center there for the battalion, the Mormon battalion. And it's really interesting because despite the fact that they weren't called to actually fight, the movement or the migration of those members, and it wasn't all males. There were some females that were
Yeah.
there to,
Yeah.
right? They went from, and I forget where they started. They might have started in Missouri and they
Far
came all the
west
way
or
west. Yeah, but it was a very
somewhere.
unifying process for them.
Yeah.
They grew together, it spiritually, and from that group, you see later on many leaders of the church that became apostles and presidents of the church that were part of that group.
Oh,
So
okay.
it had a very important purpose aside from military and all that kind of stuff. It had a spiritual process. The Lord used that experience to build testimonies and prepare individuals for service in the church much later on,
Oh,
for
wow.
sure.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Now, it's been I'm trying to find some words here to continue the basically I really appreciate it all. Did you have any other insights or anything like that you wanted to share with us now? Or maybe well, I know that we want to do some more videos like this, obviously. You've got
Yeah, you know
plenty
what
to
I would
say.
sure what I would love to do, and I'd be happy if you invite others as well.
Yeah,
The more the merrier. I think it would be great to have like a topic, right? Like pick a topic. And with a few weeks in advance, we all prepare for it,
yeah.
right? We read up on that topic and then we come to the table and we just kind of share our insights, what we found. And maybe it's just as simple as picking, you know,
The
I don't
come
know.
follow me topic or whatever.
Yeah, right. Or we stick with the Book of Mormon, which might
Yeah.
be even better, right? Since we're all reading right now the New Testament anyway, but this forces us to stick with the Book of
Yes.
Mormon,
That's a
right?
great idea. So
Yeah, and we just pick a book, right? Like we say, hey, let's read I don't know, first book of Nephi.
yeah,
And in 2 weeks, bring out your insights, what jumped out at you. And everybody's gonna have different things anyway. So it would be a great experience.
that
I'll
would
tell
be
you what I do
wonderful.
miss with the now everything is digital, right? So I
Yeah.
mean when I go I taught gospel doctrine this past year, and of course everything is electronic. So I do all my presentations on PowerPoint, and then when we read the scriptures, I'm either reading it off my phone or an iPad, but it's all the digital version, right? And I actually miss the hard copy, the books that we used to use because I used to mark them up like crazy. I had
Yeah.
notes, colors. It was all color coded, and I had all sorts of comments and things on the margins,
Yeah.
and that's lost now. Like I know you can put comments and you can color, but it doesn't stand out the same way it used
What could you possibly want to write more into the Book of Mormon than you? I
to.
mean, you've already only read it,
I know, but that's the beauty of it. Every time you
yes.
had an insight, right?
You,
Every time
you,
you had an insight, you would write it down,
yeah.
and I had quotes from different leaders of the church, or I had insights that I had found in the document or the what do you call it, the commentaries of the
Yeah.
Book of Mormon. But now that a lot of that is lost, so as I read now through the digital versions, I find I'm adding comments, right? You know how you add a comment on in
Yeah.
the digital version, and so it puts this little page thing off to the side, a little icon, but then you
Okay.
got to click on it to see it, right?
Yeah.
So it
But it's
doesn't
not right
stand
there.
out. No,
Yeah.
it doesn't stand out like it used to. I
That's
miss the old books.
so again, one of the last questions I want to ask real quick. Obviously, from our conversation, you did learn a couple of things, or at least one thing about, the Book of Mormon. When you're do you basically read that every year, or do you
Yeah, I try to.
yeah.
And what I find is I was thinking about that actually before I jumped on the call. Normally, what happens is I get into um, periods where I'll start reading it and maybe I put it down and then sort of lose myself with some other stuff, or trying to stay up with the Come Follow Me.
Yeah.
But eventually I go back to it and I'll finish it off. So yeah, I try to do it once a year at least. Um, but I don't always
Yeah.
go straight through from January right through to it just happens at different times of the year, but I
That's
definitely try to do it once a year.
that's cool.
Right. And
Now,
there's always ways of studying the Book of Mormon. Like, you don't have to. I've not always started it at First Nephi. There are times where I really want to get into a certain book, and so I'll just jump right into that book. Um, I always find the Book of Ether is like a short version of the Book of Mormon, right?
okay, yeah,
Because it's a very similar story, right? They
yeah.
leave from the old world, they come here, and then you have a very abbreviated version, of course,
But
of,
there's
of
only
the Book
like
of
three
Mormon.
chapters that are really dealing with the Jaredites, I believe is correct.
It's a bit more than that. It's a bit more than that. And of course you get,
Well, I
like
mean,
I
as
said,
far
it's
as
very brief
Moroni's
though.
focus on the Jaredites, maybe
Yeah.
5 chapters, but I think the rest of it is
Um,
commentary. There's a lot of commentary that Moroni's interjecting into
yes.
that based on his own experiences he's having.
Right.
Plus, he's bringing in the Jaredite story to kind of re-emphasize what he's going through, plus what the Jaredites were going through at the same time.
Yeah.
If
Well, I
that,
th I think there's a lot of reasons for that book being in there. I mean, obviously he felt inspired to include it, right, as part of the story that we now have in the Book of Mormon. Uh, and of course, a lot of it is because of the teachings that are in there. It's also to me, it's almost like a second account of the same things that can happen when a people, a society, turn their back on the Lord. They'll
yeah,
get destroyed. It's happened twice. It happened to the Nephites and it happened to the Jaredites, right?
and it's
And but
happening today.
yeah, yeah. And the other thing I think is really valuable from that book, like where did that book come from, right? I mean, do you remember where that came from? Where did we get the Book of Ether?
It was Coriantum. There was the last person that was in the Book of Ether was living still when well,
Yeah, which was
yeah, help
Coriantum.
me out, help me out.
Yeah,
You know
it
what
was
I'm talking about.
Coriantumr, right? But how we actually found those plates, right? 24 gold plates,
Right.
and they contained the history of the jury. So what happened? You remember Limhi?
Yeah.
The people of Limhi were lost, and they were trying to get back to Zarahemla, and they sent out these scouts, and they came back. They lost themselves, and they came back, and they said, "I don't know, we got lost, but by the way, we found this land that had obviously been inhabited by people because all we found was bones, and we also found these plates that were probably written by those people, but we can't read them because they're in another language."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
of course, what happens there is that they're told that when they get back to Zarahemla, there's a man there who can interpret
Mosiah.
them, and that's
Yeah.
Mosiah as a second. And so Mosiah gets them and he reads them. And I always found it interesting that shortly after that, Mosiah, of course, is confronted with that challenge of who's going to succeed me, and
Yeah.
none of his four boys want to take on that responsibility. They're off teaching the Lamanites, and neither
Yeah.
one of them had any interest in being a king, which again I find fascinating. And so now he's left with that dilemma, right? Okay, well now who am I going to make the king? And I can't help but feel that he had to have relied upon what he had just translated in the Jaredite record, because what happens in the Jaredite record? King after king is destroyed, killed, by
Yeah.
sometimes by their own family,
Wow.
and it's a story of pride and power. And I can't help but think that he probably thinks, you know what? I just finished translating this document of the Jaredites who had constant issues with kings. And if we don't get the right king here, we're going to be in trouble again. We already know that it's happened to us with King Noah, right?
Yeah.
And that wasn't that long before Mosiah. So I have a feeling that he used that as, this is my only theory, right? It's my own theory,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I just think that he was really influenced by what he read there. And so what does he say? Okay, we don't have a clean winner here in terms of who's going to be the next king. The ones to whom the kingdom should have gone
Yeah.
are not here. They don't want it. So if I open this up, who knows which direction this is going to go? We could end up with another issue like the Jared said. So you know what? I'm going to change the system altogether. We're going to have a system of judges, which is going to be safer, more democratic, right? Brilliant, brilliant decision by
There's
him.
so much in that story when that it's you can see it today. He talks about it then, and it's like
Hmm.
when the minority become
Yeah,
the voice of the law
right.
is basically what he's saying.
Yeah,
When they are the ones that are creating the laws,
then you're in
then
trouble.
corruption is upon the nation.
Yeah.
And you can see all the little splinter groups that are in the United States right now, especially,
Oh,
who
it's
are
in Canada
making the
too.
loudest noise, but are the very
Yeah.
least of us who are making the laws
They
of
don't
the country.
represent, yeah, they don't represent the majority.
Right.
And yet they are able to push their agendas. And yeah, it's exactly what he was talking about. And if you get a king that is like his father, right, King Benjamin,
Right.
then yeah, you're good to go. But if you get one like King Noah, or you get others that start influencing the king with those ideas, now you're in trouble,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And you're right. And I mean, we don't even have kings in our countries, in our respective countries, and yet look at the effect that those small groups can have, right? And they're creating all sorts of confusion, right? And Satan's really good with that because Satan uses words that sound really good, right? Like words like equity and inclusion. I mean, those words sound fabulous, right? Yeah, who doesn't want to have a civilization, a society that's inclusive, that is equitable, that treats everyone the same? And yet, that's the opposite of what ends up happening, right?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
those are the words that are used to actually create splinter groups.
And
And we're
also
becoming,
creates a slave nation too,
yeah, and we're
because
becoming more
eventually
like,
because
sorry,
eventually what you have to do is you have to force people into work in order to continue your reign over them, because without the
mhm,
economic uh, uh, uh,
engine.
foundation,
Yeah,
your kingdom is gone because other nations have come in and taken it over. So
yeah.
the only way to keep your nation is to enslave people to work so that you can continue to prosper.
Hmm. Well, look at what
But it's a
happens with
failed
the,
system.
yeah,
Venezuela and every
absolutely.
other country.
Look what happens with the Nephites, right? When they finally start splintering after the visit of Christ, right?
Right.
They start splintering into clans,
Yeah.
right? And isn't that what's kind of happening right now? Satan is trying to
Well, it's
splinter us
happened
into
since
clans.
it happened back in. If you look at the timeline, let's pretend that 2030 or so is the return of Christ.
Hmm.
And so that would be so at the time that Joseph Smith came, that restored the gospel, restored the church,
200 years.
200 years. All right. Now look at when the splinter group started in the fourth chapter or the fourth book of Nephi. It was
Yeah,
about 160 years after that,
yeah. It
that
doesn't take
that
long.
coming. And
Yeah.
then you have in the United States, when the names African American, Mexican American, Chinese American, when
Hmm.
that became popular back in the 50s
Hmm.
or the 60s, actually there's more the 60s, because before that it was like, I'm an American, I disown anything that I have that is associated with my former country, because now I'm an American.
Yeah.
Now everybody wants to become unique to their own self. And so
Well,
they
it's
use
the
divisionary
hyphen.
words to create that.
It's a hyphenated identity, right?
Yeah,
So yeah, like I'm a good example because I come from Uruguay and I still consider myself partly Uruguayan, and I speak the language and I understand the culture and I love to travel there and everything. But at the end of the day, though, I'm also Canadian. But I don't draw the line and specify that I need special, needs, or you need to treat me any different. And because at the end of the day, we're all sons and daughters of the
right.
same God. But Satan obviously doesn't want that narrative. He wants the narrative that we should all splinter and differentiate ourselves and create division, right? Because at the end of the day, what's that going to create? That's going to create division, and it's going to create, discord or among us.
But it's just, you look at Joseph Smith and how does Joseph Smith put that in the same kind of timeline?
Hmm.
It's crazy,
Yeah.
that timeline that is presented, and there's so many timelines that I can present to you, and we can do this in a different discussion. That Joseph Smith is like right on cue on everything that's was written in the Book of Mormon and what we're experiencing today.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah,
you know,
no, absolutely. Yeah. And you don't need a lot of time for things to change, right?
yeah,
Things can change very quickly.
and there's one of the complaints that people have is, well, look at the size of the population in the when in the Lamanite or the Nephite Lamanite communities. It's huge. Well, they forget LA. LA is like a very young city, but
Hmm.
yet it's got, oh, I think 13 million people
Yeah,
or
right.
so, you know.
Yeah.
Doesn't, and it's a very small area.
Hmm.
So it
Yeah.
doesn't take long for places to grow in numbers by massive amount.
Yeah,
It just,
absolutely.
you know, over, it's less than 100 years old. LA, that, you know, that we went from almost maybe 10 or 15,000, and now we have 13 million 100 years later.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's,
no,
you
for
know,
sure.
so that population grows real quick.
Yeah. So what, tell you what, why don't we schedule something down the road here? Like,
Yeah.
we can keep in touch.